This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm joined by Joash Thomas. Born and raised in India, Joash served as a U.S. political consultant and lobbyist before pivoting to global human rights advocacy. Now based in the Toronto area, he holds a master's degree in political management from the George Washington University and has completed master's degrees in Christian leadership and Christian studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. A deacon in the Diocese of St. Anthony, Joash is also the author of the new book, The Justice of Jesus, which was just released September 30th. So thanks for joining me today, Joash. It's great to have this conversation.
Honored to be here, Andrew. Yeah, looking forward to this.
Awesome. Really enjoyed your book. And just as we start, I think your background sort of really sheds light into your work and your book. And so can you give the listeners just a little background into your story of who you are and where you were from and your pivot?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Mumbai, India, into a family that's been Christian for 2,000 years, going back to the Apostle Thomas, who brought the gospel to my ancestors. And so my ancestors and my family have been everything from Orthodox to Catholic to Anglican to Pentecostal for the last 5 generations.
Wow.
And, I think as a result of that, I tend to be very ecumenical. I often feel like a mutt in the larger global church. I can fit in everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And I find myself unable to look down on any one tradition or look up to any one tradition as the perfect tradition. I think we all have things to learn from each other in the global church. So, that was my family story. And then moved to the U.S. when I was 18, worked in the U.S. political world and Georgia Republican politics before Jesus saved me again, as I like to say, and then immigrated to Canada after that. So I'm a 2-time immigrant to North America, and it's been a beautiful journey.
No, I can imagine. And so as you were, raised in India for a lot of your formative years, like what role did food and hospitality play for your family, especially as Christians living, in what we usually think of as a predominantly Hindu area? Like, how did food and hospitality fit into who you are?
Yeah, great question. Food is such an important part of South Asian culture, or any South Asian culture. I think something that people don't realize about the Indian subcontinent is that there's a plethora of diversity with, and you would know this as a professional chef, but like there's a plethora of options with cultures, and that diversity is reflected in our food. So India has about 28 states. Every state has its own language, its own predominant religion, its own food that's different. And so, and everyone has their own different way of making biryani or a chai. And so there's beauty when all of that comes together in a city like Mumbai, which tends to be very cosmopolitan because it's an urban center. It's a city of Bollywood and all that. So people come from all over. My grandparents came from the South. And it's beautiful. You get to live in multiculturalism, and you get to enjoy the best of all the worlds of food.
Yeah. Awesome. If you were to have a comfort food dish from India, like what's that dish you go to that just is like screams home to you?
Great question. It would be a biryani. I can have biryani with meat for breakfast, lunch, or dinner.
Gotcha. And for listeners who aren't familiar with biryani, like can you describe it? Give us, aromas, flavors, like make us hungry a little as we
Absolutely. So the good news is almost any Indian restaurant should have this dish.
Right.
Usually a chicken biryani, or I prefer a lamb or a goat biryani if you can
Mm.
find it.
Yep.
And biryani was brought to us from the Mughals, who
Huh.
were our rulers for many centuries, and they came from Persia. So it's a good blend of Persian, Afghani, Pakistani, Indian cuisine. It's basically rice with meat. Some parts of India throw in potatoes, others throw in tomatoes. You can make it your own depending
Yeah.
on. India probably has over 100 different types of biryanis. And then something else I'd say is the main star, though, is not the rice. The main star of the biryani is the meat. So you cook the rice and the meat separately, and then you cook it both together. And you ultimately want the rice to be flavored by the meat. It's
Hmm.
beautiful.
Yeah. And do sometimes some biryanis have a pastry crust over the top, correct?
Yes, fried
Okay.
onions. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, or a pastry. Yes, I get what you're saying with naan kind of covering the
Hmm.
top. Yes,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately, not an option if you're gluten free,
No.
but otherwise, terrific option. I love it that way.
Yeah. No, there's an Indian restaurant near my parents in Orange County that we've had biryani from, and they have the pastry crust, and they come to the table and
Yes,
shatter it for you, and
that's
it's
awesome. That's a
phenomenal.
very luxurious way to eat it for sure. I
Yeah,
love it.
yeah. No, this is a higher end fun, and
Hmm.
they're halal, um, you know,
Makes
but yeah,
sense.
they're just yeah, it's good Indian food is just so delicious and flavorful, and the amalgamation of spices and heat and texture. Yeah, my wife and I love it.
Uh, yeah, sounds like you're very familiar with it. I love it. Love it.
Asian food, I think Asian food just I think I love Chinese food, Thai food, Korean, Indian food. I think that just the Asian continent just makes food in such a beautiful way that I'm
Yes,
partial to. But
100%. Yeah. And again, there's so much diversity
yeah,
and it all mixes. And so, for example, you probably know this, Andrew, but there's this whole genre of food called Hakka food or Indian Chinese food,
okay,
which is not real Chinese food. It's like a blend of Indian food and Chinese food. So it's Chinese food like fried rice and lo mein and all that, but with spices, with Indian
oh,
spices, and it's quite popular across India, especially the north. But brought to us by the Hakka people,
huh,
who um, look Chinese but are culturally very Indian and
okay.
live in India for
Wow.
generations.
No, I've not heard of hookah cuisine, and that does sound, yeah. Okay, yeah. We could probably talk about food most of this time, and then get really hungry. But, um, so you come to America. You're working as a political consultant
Yeah,
in the Republican Party, and you say
yeah,
that Jesus saved you again. And so, like,
yeah.
what was that process, and how did that transition go? And like, when did you sort of begin to realize, hey, I need to get out of the politics, or this sort of politics, for my own sake?
Yeah. I got into politics because of my Christian faith. I think that is the reality. I think many Christians do.
Yeah.
For me, in specific, it was because of my passion for justice. I've always been passionate about justice as a global South Christian, and then
Yeah.
came to the West and realized that people in the church don't really talk about justice. It's seen as Marxist or woke or out
Yep.
there, and ended up just yeah, that was a very early observation I had, and I mentioned that at the beginning of the book. But then, I wanted to make a difference for my marginalized neighbors. I thought politics was the best route to do that. So I got involved with a few local politicians who happened to be with the Republican Party, and as I worked with them, my theology, my faith started to be shaped by what I was being mentored in from them. Um, and I was never so there were lines I wouldn't cross. Like I left ultimately with the rise of Trumpism because I felt like that
Yeah.
was a line I never wanted to cross. And I never crossed a bunch of different lines that I felt like were opposing to our marginalized neighbors. But I think in the American South, evangelical church, you're conditioned into thinking that this is the only option for Christians.
Yep.
There's history behind this, racial history behind it too. But so I had to. I had to have a series of rude awakenings that I
I'm
talk
sure.
about in the book, and then ultimately, it's because of my passion for justice for all my marginalized neighbors that I had to leave this political party that only embodied justice for a few categories of marginalized neighbors while neglecting everyone else.
Yep.
Not that the other party is any better, and they're slightly better, but not necessarily championing justice for all our marginalized neighbors. So I think over time I've come to realize that the voice of the church should be an independent one that speaks truth to power, regardless of who is in power on behalf of our marginalized neighbors at all
Yeah.
times.
That's what I really appreciated about your book is, that, you balance this fine line of, like speaking truth, and harsh truth, and good truth, but also wanting to maintain hope for even the white evangelical church. Like you're not
Yeah.
and which I really appreciate, because sometimes it's so easy as all of us are trying to make sense of our upbringing as evangelicals, like, where do we fit, and wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But you seem to be like,
Mm,
no, the church is still the hope and we can be a voice. And so like, how do you do it? Like, cause it's tricky because it's not an easy line, right? It's easier to live on the extremes, but you seem to be
yeah.
walking this good fine line that wants to give hope to both sides.
Mm, yeah. I think for me, so much of that was shaped by my time on the margins.
Hmm.
Because when I started working in international human rights after leaving Republican politics, um, I did not expect to find Jesus on the margins as much as I did.
Wow.
So I say in the book that
Yeah.
I thought I'd find Jesus in the halls of power of Georgia Republican politics. Didn't find him there. Found him on the margins when I started working among survivors of trafficking and violence.
Hmm.
They taught me way more about Jesus than I could have ever imagined, even if they never mentioned Jesus by name, because
Right.
you need to cultivate the eyes to see Jesus there.
Yeah.
And the reason why I mentioned that is because once you learn to see Jesus in the most
Hmm.
unlikely places, like the margins,
Yeah.
you then start to have eyes to see Jesus again in other unlikely places, like the white evangelical church
Right.
or a Muslim mosque or a Hindu temple or a Sikh temple, right? Like, because Jesus is everywhere.
Right.
Christ is all and in all, and he's transcendent everywhere. And so, if I believe that I can find Jesus in the margins, if I believe that I can find Jesus um, in other cultures and religions, find signs of him there, then I think we can also say the same for the white evangelical church, because God
Yeah.
is not done. He hasn't given up on his children anywhere.
I appreciate that of, and you reiterate that in the book of that, so often those of us in power or those of us who have benefited most from colonialism, and we think we're taking Jesus to the margins, but you really want to help us see that no, like Jesus is already there. Like, how do you cultivate the eyes to see Jesus in the margins? Which is such a beautiful, more profound, but yet harder task.
Yes, yes, it definitely comes with its challenges, and it also comes with a level of privilege too, right? So there are many people from marginalized communities who have been harmed by the white
Mm.
evangelical church, and they may not have the capacity or the healing from the trauma or the privilege to go into these spaces and be messengers for peace and justice, but
Right.
others could. Others, maybe from majority white evangelical cultures, um, and especially men, do have that privilege of being seen as the same or accepted as the same, and they can be peacemakers in these
Mm.
contexts that marginalized communities like mine, as a brown immigrant, possibly can't. And so, I think it's for all of us to discern where we can step in with the privileges that we have, just like Jesus steps in for us with
Right.
laying aside his divine privileges in Philippians chapter 2
Yeah.
and taking the form of marginalized human flesh.
And so as we begin to want to step into these places, obviously a lot of talk has been centered in the recent years with the rise of Trump of this deconstruction. But you go further to say deconstruction with without decolonization is pointless and ultimately does nothing for our marginalized neighbors.
Yeah.
So help our listeners, help me. Like, can you unpack that statement? Because, you're asking us to take another step of what it means to embody Jesus in these turbulent times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say this throughout the book too, but colonialism wasn't just bad for the global South church or for the global South. It was also bad for the Western church that participated in it, right?
Yep.
And I've learned this working in the international human rights, the justice space for the last decade. Injustice isn't just bad for the humanity of the oppressed, it's also bad for the humanity of the oppressors,
Yeah.
and those on their side. And
Mm-hmm.
in the case of Western colonialism, the Western church participated in colonialism, benefited from colonialism. And whether we realize it or not, it shaped us. It shaped our theology. It shaped our praxis. It shaped the way we see Jesus, the way we love God and love neighbor.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for us to reckon with that, because something I see is I often see a lot of well-meaning progressive evangelicals leave the evangelical church and then embody the same type of colonized fundamentalism that we see them being harmed by, right? Because that's all they've ever known. And so this is where I challenge us in the Western church to learn from the church on the margins, to learn from the global South church, feminist theologians, LGBTQ theologians. You don't have to agree with everything they say, but hear them out and be challenged, because again, Jesus is everywhere.
Right. And that's the challenge of, okay, how do we begin? If this is the only air we've breathed, or, the water we've swam in, whatever metaphor you want to use, right? Like,
Right.
to begin to see how it has impacted us. And it's hard because, again, when you're in it, it's hard for me as a white middle class evangelical, born and raised, right? Like, to see it. And so, like, where do you see the um the gospel has been co-opted by colonialism? Like, can you give us an example, just so, like, you know maybe
Yeah.
start to take the scales off of our eyes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll start with this, and I mentioned this in the book as a key question that pushed me to decolonize my own theology. Is working in international human rights in the anti-human trafficking space for the past decade, and then regularly coming across evangelical pastors, both in the U.S. and Canada, who would say things like, "What's the point of rescuing children from trafficking if their souls go to hell? Aren't they dead in the water anyway?" Right? Or sitting across a friend from the staff team of one of the largest churches in Canada, who oversaw missions outreach, and him just telling me that his pastor says that the gospel is both physical and spiritual. His pastor says that justice is important, but when it comes time to budgetary decision makings within the church, when the choice is between rescuing bodies from human trafficking or violence, or airdropping, and this is a real example, airdropping, parachuting radios with Christian
Yeah.
programming into parts of Europe, they'll go with that, because if we can save some souls, that's worth it than rescuing bodies and them not finding Jesus, right? So it kind of raises these questions of, okay, like, where does this come from? And I think in the book I spell out a few tenets of the colonizers' theology.
Yeah.
Yeah, happy to talk about any of that. But one of the things that I spell out is, uh, just this belief that Jesus came to rescue souls more than bodies.
Right.
Jesus cares way more about uh, the future of my soul, the salvation of my soul, than the freedom and well-being of my human body. When if you read the Gospels, that's just not true.
Yeah.
Jesus cares both about the body and the soul. He's healing sick people. He's setting people oppressed by demons free. He's feeding hungry people. Like, he cares both about the body and the soul. But you see this dichotomy in the Western church because of colonialism, because colonizers and slaveholders told people they colonized and enslaved, Jesus cares way more about your soul than your body. So don't worry about the chains on your bodies.
Hmm.
Just focus on the spiritual. And the same thing is said today in the church, and it hurts us way more than we ever know. And it shapes us to resist justice today.
For sure. No, and it sort of goes back to Jesus's words in Luke 4, or, Isaiah 61, that prophecy too, of which Jesus reads from in Luke 4, of like, do we actually think those are literal words? Or is it just a spiritual that Jesus came to set the oppressed free? Or we mean the spiritually oppressed? Or Jesus came to
Yeah.
loose the chains? Like, no, your spiritual chains.
Right.
I remember interviewing with a church. This was back in 2020, 2021. And we were talking, and I mentioned, I think, when Jesus is saying that, like, I think he means something physical and like actual literal. And the pastor was like, well, you're going to have to prove that to me, because that's just not the case. And you're like,
Mm,
all right, I
mm.
think this interview's done. Like, I think we're diametric, but it's that where we see Jesus's words and we take them spiritually instead of literally.
Yes, yes. And I would say that that's horrible biblical exegesis.
Yeah.
Like I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, the most conservative evangelical theological seminaries. And even in the most conservative evangelical seminaries, you're taught to take scripture seriously by looking at the original context. So let's look at the original context of Luke chapter 4, right?
Right.
Who is Jesus's audience when he's saying this to? Um, they're poor people, people who
Yeah.
are physically poor and physically oppressed by the Roman Empire, right? And we see verses like Jesus saying, "Blessed are the poor," and we say, "Oh well, Jesus just means spiritually poor."
Yeah.
When Matthew's gospel says, "No, blessed are the poor," and it's he's actually talking to poor people who are
Yeah.
under the boot of empire, right? And so I think it's so hard for so many of us in the Western church to step aside from our privileges, our 21st century modern lenses, to see, okay, Jesus's audience, who he was preaching this to, how would they have received this as good
Yeah.
news? And when we do that, and I think we can do that today by learning from our marginalized neighbors who are under the boot of empire,
Yeah.
and it's when we do that that the gospel just hits different.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because you mentioned that empires are never set up with their marginalized neighbors flourishing in mind.
Yes,
You know.
yes. Yes, they're only set up to serve the rich and the powerful,
Yep.
and the people who serve the rich and the powerful, and that is not the job of the church. The job of the church is to stand in the gap. Uh, you know, we come from a long line of prophets who stood in the gap between the
Yeah.
poor and the oppressed, and those with power, the rulers, and who spoke truth to power on behalf of the poor and the oppressed, sometimes at great personal cost, and who
Mm-hmm.
did that in love, who did that from a posture of truth, but also from a posture of love for both the oppressed and the oppressor. And that is the task of the church today.
And your book really wants to bring, okay, how do we actually move into these spaces? How do we bring justice to bear? And one of the places, obviously, that I wholeheartedly agree with you and shouted amen, posted about it on Instagram, is recentering the table. Like, and this is, you sort of even begin here. You say, like, really to decolonize our gospel, we need to decenter the pulpit and recenter the table, and specifically the Lord's table,
Yeah.
or the Eucharist, or however your
Yeah.
tradition calls it. So, like, why do we need to start there? Because the
Yes. Yes.
Western church would say we just need more education. Like,
Yes.
if we just preach better, if we just preach the gospel, like,
Right.
that's going to change.
That's going to change. Yeah. Yeah. And that is absolutely a myth, because how's that working out for us?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And don't ask ourselves as church leaders. I say this as an ordained church minister myself, but ask our marginalized neighbors, do they feel included in the
Right.
church? Do they feel safe and protected and advocated for in the church? And
Yeah.
the vast majority of them don't in the Western church, right? And so it's not working out well for us. So what I would say to that lovely question is, just look at church history, right? Take a survey of church history. And again, I learned this in evangelical theological seminary in the
Yeah.
West. For the first 1500 years of the church, it wasn't the pulpit that was the center of the Sunday morning worship. It wasn't the preacher in the pulpit.
No.
It was the table.
Yeah.
And the theology of the Eucharistic table for the first 1500 years of the church was that Jesus was physically present at the table somehow in a mysterious way. We can't
Right.
explain it, don't
No.
know how this works. That's
Yeah.
where faith comes in.
Yep.
But Jesus is present at the table, and so Jesus is the center of our attention, and our liturgy and our preaching. All of it points to pulling people to the table and to be reconciled at the table, and then from the table we go out to bring peace and shalom and justice into the world, right? And that was
Yeah.
always the way the liturgical services were set up. And not to say that that didn't get co-opted by empire too, but what's easy for the empires of our day today is to co-opt the pulpit. Post-Reformation, the pulpit
Yeah.
became the center of the Sunday morning worship, and the preacher in the pulpit became the center. And when the preacher has a scandal, or the preacher disappoints without a scandal, people lose their faith, because their faith isn't centered on the real presence of Jesus at the table.
Mm.
It's now been replaced by this preacher, who is a fallible human being at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And so I say, and I think you quoted this, but let's decenter the fallible presence of the preacher at the table, and recenter the infallible presence of Christ at the table.
Right. But that also makes, we need a richer theology, because
Yes.
part of it has been, we have an emaciated theology of the table. Like,
Mm.
The tradition I grew up in, we would celebrate communion maybe once a month, and it would sometimes be in the evening and not part of Sunday morning. And even with churches I've been to that celebrate with it weekly, it's sort of an add-on. Like there's very little theological, it feels like, reflection, and again, I'm not saying, we need more education, but like it seems like we need a richer theology of the table.
Yes.
And so many of my listeners probably don't have power to change the rituals of a church, but how do we begin to then think about the table in a more robust way? Because too often it's a Jesus and me moment, a forgiveness of sins, where I just encounter Jesus individually as a sole person, versus a robust communal activity where we realize how much we actually have in common.
Absolutely. And I think this also comes from Western individualism, of just reducing our faith to an individualistic expression, when that wasn't the case for the early church, right? So Acts chapter 2, you see the early church gathering regularly at the table, and then going from that table to proclaim the goodness of God into the brokenness of this world, right? The good news of Jesus, holistically in word and in deed. And these tables were like the center of that revival in their communities and in their society. The magic happened at the table. And I think what's really powerful about the table is that it levels everything out, right? Socioeconomic status, caste status, all of that is leveled out at the table. Racial status, all that's leveled out, because at the table, everyone's the same. Everyone's one before Christ. There's no Jew nor Greek, no slave nor free, no male, female, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-women's rights, anti-abortion. Like there's none of that. None of those man-made distinctions exist at the table. All we have at the table are us as one humanity, and God through Christ, mediated through Christ, and we're reminded that we have more in common with each other than our differences, and ultimately Christ reconciles us at the table. So in the early church, you see the table being this important thing, so much so that in 1 Corinthians, you have Paul teaching the church, hey, let the poor come and eat first at the table. People who haven't eaten, people who are hungry, let them go first, eat at the table, and then everyone else come. And even that was, oh my goodness, preferential treatment for people who are poor. That is not the way first century society was set up. That is not the way 21st century society is set up either. But there's something beautiful about recentering the table and recentering Jesus's presence at the table. So, I see a lot of progressive evangelical churches centering the table,
Hmm.
but they do so in a way that doesn't acknowledge Jesus's real presence at the table. They
Hmm.
do so in a way where it's like, well, if you just have a bunch of food and chips and crackers and
Yeah.
grape juice, like that's fine. Like that's all you need. But I would say no. When we say that, we're being cut off from the tradition of the church, which for 1,500 years acknowledged that there's something happening
Right.
through the elements being served at the table
Yeah.
by leaders in the church who, when they hand out the body and blood of Christ, it's not about them. They're taking a step back and they're saying, the body of Christ for you,
Hmm. Yep.
the blood of Christ shed for you and for your healing, and through your healing, the healing of the world.
And that's the beauty of the table. And yet like you said, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul admonishes the church because empire has already moved in within, less than a decade probably of a church starting. The empire
Yeah.
and empire mindsets quickly co-opt, and people are prone, we're prone as humans to move back to what we know and is comfortable. And that's,
Yes.
so like, even then, like, as we want to recenter the table, empire and politics and old ways of being can quickly creep in, which is really challenging because like it's not easy, right? Like our pull is always back, it feels like, towards separatism or empire minded thinking versus how do we keep Jesus as the focus.
Absolutely. Individually and as a church
Yep.
and as a collective society. And this is why I think, you have, I'm not talking about what has been called a revival in the North American church, because, there are people still being enslaved and
Right.
all that. How much of a revival was that really, of a holistic gospel demonstration? But I think throughout church history, you have revivals seen and unseen that emerge and pop up, and people find their way back to Jesus. But then the allure of empire is too strong,
Yeah.
and we haven't done a good job of discipling our people to resist empire, resist empires of our day, to watch out for that. We have over individualized scriptures like, don't be tainted by the world. And we make that all about sexual sin, when in reality, that's actually about protecting ourselves from the tainting of the systems and structures of the world, like the oppressive empires of our day, and the way that conditions us to come up with our own caste systems wherever we are. So, absolutely.
And so as we decenter the table sort of in our collective worship gatherings, faith communities, churches, whatever that is for, people, like how can then the table in our own homes or in our neighborhoods then be areas of decolonization and, flourishing for everybody?
That's beautiful. Yeah. I think it starts with preferential treatment towards people who are poor and oppressed, right? And this is something that I found in Catholic social teaching and liberation theology that I feel like the evangelical church desperately needs. Like, if there's one thing that people walk away with after reading my book, I hope it's this thing. It's that God always stands with people who are poor and oppressed, always. And if God does that, then we as the church have a responsibility to do the same, regardless of who's in power, regardless of whether or not we've been conditioned to hate the people group who are being oppressed, like our Palestinian neighbors right now. If we're conditioned to distrust them because they're from a different religion, like Islam, or a different ethnic group like the Arab group, regardless of all that, we're called to stand with those who are being oppressed, even if the oppressed and the oppressors switch sides. Because when the oppressed and the oppressors switch sides, which happens regularly throughout human history, then God also switches sides to stand with the newly oppressed people, because that's where Jesus is. And now, does this mean that God hates the rich and the powerful? Absolutely not. But the rich and powerful are going to be fine because they have wealth, they have resources, they have the support of empire. People who are poor and oppressed have no one to stand on their side. And so God stands on their side, not because of their ontological goodness, but because of the goodness of God,
Right.
because that's who he is. He stands with the powerless. And so I think we need to bring that to the table.
Yeah.
We need to take a look around that table and see, who are we including here and who are
Mhm.
we keeping out of the table. And I mean, think about it this way, right? Like, if Judas had a seat at Jesus's table, and Jesus knew
Yeah.
who Judas was, what he'd done, what he was about to do, betray him. But if Judas had a seat at Jesus' table, then all of us have a seat at Jesus' table. What we
Mhm.
do after we walk away from the table is our choice, because God gives us agency. But
Yeah.
the table is a space for everyone who
Mhm.
wants to encounter Jesus. And I say this to church leaders too, who, you know, wouldn't be comfortable with having people who are not Christian participate at the table. I would say to them, well, if we believe that Jesus is at the table, or we believe that there's something holy about this that points to Jesus, right? Whatever our
Yeah.
theology is, we believe that this points to Jesus even in some way. Why would we keep people from
Yeah.
experiencing Jesus, especially if they want to?
Yeah. Amen
Like
and amen.
let them come. It's a feast. And I wish Jesus preached a parable about there being a lot of empty seats at the table.
Yeah.
And wait, actually, he did, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah. And Judas had a seat at that last table. Jesus washed his feet. Jesus offered him the first communion. He, like he offered
Yes,
Judas
yes,
forgiveness. Like there's something that happened there that I want to believe Jesus in love is still reaching out to Judas. And
right,
so, so if
right.
Judas is there and Jesus serves Judas, who are we to deny other people the opportunity to experience Jesus?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is why, as much as I, have been shaped by the beautiful theology of even the Catholic Church, I
Right.
disagree at times when that theology of the table is weaponized, when
Yeah.
certain politicians are banned from the table by the church because of their political views one way or the other. No. Wouldn't you want this person to experience Jesus and be transformed by the touch of Jesus and the presence
Yeah.
of Jesus, right? And so I think our way of understanding God and neighbor has to shift to a more love-oriented, a more
Mm.
generous version of God. And if we're okay with accepting the grace of Christ for ourselves, despite our pasts and what we've done, then why would we not do the same for our
Right.
enemies?
For sure. I always thought, like, I remember reflecting back in 2016 at the first election of President Trump, that like if he walked in to a church, would I offer him communion? Like, and if my heart says no, like I need to
Yeah.
do something, internally.
Yeah.
And that's one example, right? Like that's my example, but like how who how do we move towards people we despise, whether they're people in power or people on the margins?
Totally.
Because like
Totally.
you said, like it, you know, Jesus isn't on the side of the oppressed so that the oppressed can become the oppressors. Like
Yes.
anybody's flourishing should result in the flourishing of everybody. Like,
Yes.
there's all of this going on. And so it's this tricky balance of, as we think about what does it mean to bring justice to bear, like how it's for all, it's for the flourishing of all.
Absolutely.
Um,
And Andrew, to your point of what happens when the president of the United States, regardless of who it is,
yeah,
or your local congressman, a member of parliament, a prime minister walks into your church, well, what tends to happen these days is we give him the pulpit.
yeah,
And again, that's because the pulpit is the center of the
mm,
worship, not the
yeah,
table. Now, if the table were to be the center of the Sunday morning worship, and a politician walks in, we'd say, "Welcome, come and receive at the table," right?
yeah,
But
yep,
this is Jesus's table. This isn't the pastor's table. It's not the
yeah,
pastor's pulpit. This is about Jesus this Sunday morning. So
yeah,
come receive like everyone else. Be one.
mm-hmm,
Grace is for you too. Yeah, and
yeah,
but unfortunately, we've gone the way of centering the pulpit. So we
yeah,
give the pulpit away as a way to honor these political leaders with the best intentions, and then the pulpits get colonized by empire. and
Right.
their political agendas. Yeah.
Hmm. And so we end up listening to the people in power telling us what we think we need and what we think we need to do versus your whole point is we need dialogical partnerships with the people on the margins. We need to
Yes.
sit at their feet. Those are
Yeah.
the people we need to be sitting at, learning from versus those in power.
Absolutely. That is such a beautiful connection, Andrew, because I think the point you're making is if we make the pulpit the centerpiece of the Sunday morning and we invite people with power, we center their voices, then we're actually actively discipling the church against what it was always meant to be, which
Right.
was a space for the powerless, to behold God as their liberator and rescuer.
Hmm. And so I think many of my listeners, and this is where I struggle with, we realize the problem, we see the issues, we see the pain, the brokenness, and there's many instances where for the church to stand in the gap today to speak for the oppressed. Like, so how do people start moving from sort of a criticism mode to an active prophetic mode to bring justice to Jesus to bear, sort of on these issues we see all around us today?
Yeah, that is a great question. And when my publisher came to me to ask me to rework my proposal for the book, originally it was going to be a book that leaned more on the diagnosis side of here's
Okay.
what's broken,
Yep.
with a little bit of prognosis. But Brazos said, hey, would you actually do it the other way and make it more hopeful, prognostic? Here's where we go from this point, kind of a book versus just diagnostic, because a lot of good diagnostic work has been done by
Yep.
historians and smarter people over the last many
Yeah.
years. But where do we go from here? Where's the voice of the practitioner, and how do we embody the justice of Jesus? And so most of the book, really 6 out of 9 chapters in the book. The first 3 chapters are diagnosis, and then
Mhm.
the next 6 are hopeful prognosis, where we go from here. And the last 3 chapters, in specific, to get to your question, give us very practical ways on
Right.
how we actually embody the justice of Jesus. And so I give 3 ways to do that. They're each chapter titles too: pray, partner, and advocate. Right.
Mhm.
I think these are the 3 most effective things an individual Christian or a church community can do together: pray,
Yeah.
partner, advocate. So on the prayer side, I try to help reframe prayer for us, because so many of us have been conditioned to see prayer as this individualistic vending machine thing,
Mhm.
that's just intercessory, versus something that actually shapes us to be like Jesus in the world that we live in today,
Yeah.
like the Lord's Prayer does,
Yeah.
the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. And so, um, so, so I would say start with prayer, but don't just stay there, because if your
Mhm.
prayers aren't shaping you to become more like Jesus, then you're praying wrong. If your prayers
Mhm.
aren't shaping you to take action for justice on behalf of your marginalized neighbors, like Jesus did, then you're doing prayer wrong. So pray as a starting point to be connected to the Spirit and to have the eyes to see what the Spirit's doing around us. And then look for ways to partner with the Spirit, because
Yeah.
the good news is that the church on the margins is already active in partnering with God. Christians on the
Mhm.
margins are already doing this. So look for people of peace like that,
Yeah.
within the church and outside the church, that you can partner with to bring wholeness and shalom. Um, and that also means financially, in sacrificial ways, for the wholeness of the world. And then I talk about advocacy as well. And
Yeah.
this was probably one of my favorite chapters to write, because I have about a decade of advocacy experience in 3 different countries in the
Wow.
international human rights space.
Yep.
And I just share tips of what I've seen everyday Christians do to build relationships with government leaders and power, and to move that power on behalf of our marginalized neighbors.
Yeah. And your those last 3 chapters were great, and it's hard because like where I need to partner and advocate for will be different than
Yes.
you probably, and just not
Yeah,
even just because of location, but because of passions and um, what how God has created me to act in the world.
totally.
And so that's the struggle is like, okay, we can there's no one size fits all. uh,
Yes.
you know
Yes.
and
I tell people this throughout the book too. I can't tell you what this looks like for you, these are
No.
just a few ideas.
Yeah.
It's between you and the Holy Spirit to discern how the Spirit's leading you, between you and God, and then don't do it alone. Find others running in the same direction and go in community with them. And this is
Right.
what the church was always meant to be.
Yeah.
But we've made it about a Sunday morning sermon experience that does nothing for our marginalized neighbors.
No. I was just recently, one of our our family food center here in Flagstaff held an anti-hunger summit last week, where they brought in people from all over northern Arizona to, network and, think through, okay, how do we fight hunger and end hunger? And I think it was a great summit, and there was lots of learning and speakers from public health organizations in Arizona talking about the impacts of HR1 on SNAP benefits, and that
Mm,
they're worst case scenario is SNAP benefits in Arizona go away because of, of the wrong politicians being elected, in his words.
right.
But the sad thing was it felt like there were very few faith communities present,
Wow.
um,
Wow.
and so here's an opportunity, it felt like, to come together and work across divides, and across communal, like a coalition forming, and okay, where can the faith community step in to help and work together and raise awareness um, on these aspects?
That's beautiful that there are people outside the church doing this.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's a shame that people from the church, and the church isn't represented in conversations like this, because then clearly there's a disconnect between our prayer and our action, right? So
Right.
clearly, if we're praying, give us this day our daily bread, and I mean, I did an Instagram video about this recently. If we pray, give us this day our daily bread, then we will protect SNAP benefits from being cut
Right.
to American children, where 1 in 4 American children, if the statistics I'm familiar with are
Yeah.
correct, 1 in 4 American children receive SNAP benefits. So how can we pray, give us this day our daily bread, and then vote for politicians who um, literally cut out bread from
Right.
marginalized communities and children?
And that's where the struggle is of, I think many of us are struggling. There's so much bad news, it feels like, that
Yeah.
we're overwhelmed. And, I think my tendency is I shut down,
Mm,
uh, or I become so overwhelmed, you freeze. Um, and so how to take those small steps, and continuing persevering,
yeah.
um, is the struggle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is where prayer comes in, right? Because
Yeah.
what you talked about, freezing, um, or flight or
Yeah.
fight, these are trauma responses,
Right.
right? And in trauma therapy, therapists will often tell you that, um, even in the scientific community, there's this consensus of a higher power, you
Yeah.
know,
Right.
and, and leaning on the higher power to guide us. And for us as Christians, we have more of a framework around what that higher power looks like. Um, but it's sad that the world is the way it is, and yeah, my hope is that people are able to see prayer as a way of leaning on that higher
Mm.
power, on behalf of our marginalized neighbors. Because again, guess who cares more about the brokenness in the world than
Yeah.
we do? God does.
Yeah.
God does, and God is looking for people across the land to just rise up and have the eyes to partner with him,
Hmm.
whatever little ways they can.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, and I say this in the book too, um, our Western capitalism has shaped us to prioritize success, but
Hmm.
God doesn't call us to success. He calls us to faithfulness.
Yeah.
And so, what does it look like for us to be faithful in our context today?
Hmm. And I just keep coming back to this idea of what does it mean to then learn from our marginalized neighbors?
Yes.
The colonial gospel will say, "Hey, we go in with all the answers. We're here to fix you," whereas you're asking us in humility to learn and to say, "Okay, let's just listen," you know, um, versus prescribing their needs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm inviting us to be more like Jesus,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it, right?
Right.
And of course, I think decolonization is a means to becoming more like Jesus, because colonization has shaped us
Right.
in the ways of empire, not in the ways of Jesus, to resist the ways of Jesus. But decolonization is a means to an end of really becoming more like Jesus. And we become more like Jesus at the table when we encounter his real presence, through the body and blood of Christ, but also through the larger body of Christ, the church, when it's shaped in healthy ways that are connected to the table in the spirit and to Jesus. And so, so my prayer is that, people are motivated to ask that question of, how am I being more like Jesus? And because you don't see, I talk about this also in the book when I talk, I take Philippians 2 and Jesus's posture there. Jesus doesn't take the posture of a teacher when he comes down to earth. He is a teacher. He has answers, right? But he takes the posture of a learner. And I learned this from Willie James Jennings on a few of his lectures, Jesus' relationship with Mary, where he says Jesus was a learner with Mary, a woman. He, God allowed a woman to disciple him. It was most likely Mary who taught him his prayers as a little child, right? And Jesus also took the form of a marginalized human being, like an occupied, colonized Jewish Palestinian man, who was poor, in a carpenter working class family, in a refugee family too, and they fled to Egypt in his childhood, fleeing violence. And so I think it's time for us as the Western Church to reckon with the marginalized nature of Christ, to be shaped by that, and then to have the eyes to see the Holy Family in our refugee neighbors, to see Jesus in our working class neighbors, to see Jesus among those who are occupied or colonized and have no power.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. I love that. Just eyes to see, and where can I go and meet Jesus? In my city of Flagstaff, like on the margins, and where might that be for me? Where that might be for you as a listener?
Yeah.
Where is Jesus calling you? It's a profound question.
Yes. And what does it look like to be like Jesus on the margins, where you don't come in with answers, but you come in with the posture of a learner, to listen with humility and curiosity, the way Jesus did with everyone he engaged with.
Absolutely. And so it's a question I ask, and you've hinted at it, but it's a great summary question. What's the story you want the church to tell?
Yeah. Wow. So it's funny you asked this today, because we just finalized some stickers for the book and some graphics that basically say, "Make the gospel good news for the poor again."
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Nice.
And I think that's really what I want the church to be shaped by.
Yeah.
Even if it's a few people from the church who read this book and their lives are hopefully transformed as a result of the Spirit working through my words, I want us to remember, I want to remind us that the gospel as defined by Jesus in Luke 4:18 is ultimately good news to the poor, and if it's not good news to the poor or the oppressed or the captive, then it's not the good news of Jesus Christ. And we need to have the eyes to discern that, so anything that's presented as good news from church leaders, we need to ask ourselves, if my Black neighbor hears this, if my refugee neighbor, if my female neighbors, LGBTQ neighbors hear this, is this actually sounding like good news to them? If it's not good news to them, then it can't be the good news of Jesus.
Wow. No, I love that. I really appreciate that. That's a lot to ruminate on and think through. And a few fun questions to wrap up. That I'm anxious to hear your responses. So, what's one food you refuse to eat?
Oh, one food I refuse to eat. That is a great question. So I could either go the dietary direction on this or the preferential direction. I would say overall, I would say anything without flavor, without without spices,
Yeah.
without some kind of masala from whatever part of the world.
Okay. That's fair. I love that response. Like I've not heard that one, but no, I agree. Yes. Yes. Anything bland is not worth. Life is too short to eat bland food.
Exactly. And I mean, there's a colonization joke in there for me, which is,
Yeah.
look, my ancestors suffered because colonizers came to extract our spices more than anything else. So I'd be dishonoring my ancestors if I didn't eat food with spice.
Yes. I think I saw a meme on Facebook or Instagram from a friend
Yeah.
who said, if you're ever feeling bad about yourselves, don't forget that the colonizers came to extract spices and still can't season a chicken.
My rage towards colonialism turned into empathy when I visited the UK for my sabbatical this summer. So totally
Okay.
get that.
Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Oh, incredible question. Probably the South Indian style chicken curry I cooked last night,
Okay.
to be honest. And I mean, you probably feel this as someone who's cooked professionally. Once you keep cooking, you probably get to a certain point where you're like, I could probably cook better food than most of the restaurants in my area
Yep.
because I've been doing this a while. And so
Yep.
I'm very much in the same boat, and I've learned to enjoy my cooking a lot. Yeah.
That's awesome. And finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you only had one more meal left to enjoy, what would it be? So if Joash had one last meal, what might be on his table?
Wow. Wow. Yeah, well, not to do a plug to the book or anything, but probably my spicy butter chicken. I would
Okay.
ask to cook it for
Yeah.
myself again and cook it and eat it. And the recipe for my spicy butter chicken is actually made available for anyone who pre-orders the book.
Okay.
And if you don't get a print copy through Baker Bookhouse, if they run out of those, just DM me and I'll send you a digital copy of that if you pre-order the book. But I would say I love butter chicken, and
Okay.
so either the butter chicken I cook, or if that's not an option, then any good restaurant butter chicken works too.
Awesome. No. Oh, yeah. Let's make some butter chicken.
Yeah,
What do you have a favorite beverage when you eat your butter chicken? Like if,
yeah. I would say Coca-Cola.
okay.
Pretty much works for anything. If I were to go something more Indian, I'd say a mango shake. So I love mango lassis, but I've been appreciating mango shakes a lot more
Okay.
recently. And India has the best mangoes. I'm very biased, but
Yep.
I'm convinced India has the best mangoes.
Yes. A tropical mango. Yeah. No, there's nothing, yes. I wholeheartedly agree of fresh
Right.
mangoes coming from the true source versus our imported
Yes.
mangoes.
Yes. And if I've offended anyone by talking too much about colonialism here, if I were to share something good about maybe something that came from colonialism, it was Portuguese mangoes. The Portuguese brought mangoes from Brazil to India and contextualize it to India. And that's
Oh,
how you have some of the best mangoes in India today, called Alfonso mangoes.
oh, I did not know that the mangoes came from Brazil.
A lot of them did. Yeah. The
Okay.
good ones.
Well, Joash, I've really appreciated this conversation. Appreciate your book, your heart. And so, if people want to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
Yeah. So The Justice of Jesus is available wherever you buy your books.
Yep.
It is, just an honor for me to share my thoughts and theology and step aside and bring the thoughts and theology of the global South Church to the Western Church so that we prioritize justice for our marginalized neighbors. And then I'm also very active on social media and Substack.
Mhm.
So my Instagram is where I'm active the most. It's at Joash P. Thomas. And my Substack is Jesus, Justice, and Joash. And
Nice.
love to connect with any of your community there.
Awesome. Really appreciate it. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.